Pillow talks taxes. He has been for over 45 years, and there isn't a human on the planet who has more experience solving problems on behalf of taxpayers. He wants to solve your problem, whether you know you have one or not. So if you do have a tax problem, call the office or visit our website, TaxHelpOnline.com. If you don't have a tax problem, your current tax problem is taxes themselves. So let's get into the policy issues of today. What is the latest news on Trump cutting the IRS's workforce?
Well, there's a news report out right now, Josh, that's according to a source, which I always have trouble with the source that's never named, but supposedly it's a source that says that they're going to cut half the IRS's workforce by the end of this year. All right, that'd be 50,000 employees gone from the IRS by the end of this year, which I find to be flatly impossible. Now, what has happened is the IRS has had about 12,000 people that have left the agency here in the last 6 weeks as a result of some attrition, the new hires, the probation hires that have been fired, about 7,500 of those, and then another handful, a couple thousand, 4,000 employees that have taken the buyout where they'll get paid till the end of September, taking their retirement. So that for sure is an issue. The IRS is losing employees, no doubt about that. And one thing they're telling us is that all of this is going to impact taxpayer services, which I personally don't believe. Anytime there's a discussion about cutting spending, if you're talking about cutting spending at the state level, for example, what they do is they threaten to lay off policemen and firemen. All right, you don't lay off the most essential workers, you lay off the least essential workers. So when we're talking about the Internal Revenue Service, it's not taxpayer assistance people, it's not return processing people, it's all of the other people in the background that should be laid off, should be sent home, not the essential workers that are required to carry out the functions of the IRS.
And when you talk about taxpayer services, I mean the IRS doesn't really service the taxpayers in the first place. Most of the money that the IRS spends is on boot grinding and collection rather than any type of service. So
well, it depends what you call service, but here's what I'm talking about when I say taxpayer service. I'm talking about people that answer the phone. We're in the midst of a filing season right now. It's going to go on through the end of through middle of April. The IRS is going to get a couple 100 million phone calls, probably 150 to 170 million phone calls from people that are looking for help, which I personally think is a mistake calling the IRS for help.
I was just going to say, they only answer about 2.5% of those phone calls anyways, don't they?
Well, their phone service has been up over the last year. There's no doubt about that. But the fact of the matter is that they have had trouble historically answering the telephone. But that's where people should be put is in telephone answering. The other thing when I talk about taxpayer service is return process. About 80% of the tax returns are filed electronically, but about 20% of the returns are still filed manually on paper, and those paper returns need to be processed.
Does that mean we're at risk of seeing paper returns stashed in the ceiling tiles again, like they did in the 90s?
There was a problem with that in the 1990s when the return processors were overworked, so they were stashing tax returns in the ceiling tiles. That's true. That happened in a Philadelphia service center. The fact is that these paper returns need to be filed. More and more returns are filed every year, and a greater percentage of those returns are filed electronically. So the IRS does not have the same processing demands on it today that it did 40 years ago.
Still seems like the entirety of the IRS could be done with a database these days.
Well, here's the problem. If you're going to have an income tax system that requires people to report their income and claim their deductible expenses, and a system that requires all of the people in the United States to spy on each other, which essentially it does, then you're going to have a staff that administers the law. You can't have a requirement to file all these documents, prepare all this information, submit all this information, send money to an institution that has no capacity to carry out the functions of the administrative agency. It's absurd. What we have to be focusing on is dismantling the tax code. We got to start taking the tax code apart a piece at a time so that we can get rid of the tax code entirely and get rid of the Internal Revenue Service. The way we start with simplifying the tax code is to get rid of all of the refundable credits that are in the code. There are at least a dozen different refundable credits that are in the Internal Revenue Code. The most common one is the Earned Income Tax Credit. This is a welfare program that's implemented under the Internal Revenue Code, administered by the IRS through tax refunds. That's what it is. That's not not the core function of the Internal Revenue Service. We got to get the IRS back to its core function. If we stop this mission drift that the agency has been subjected to by Congress for the last 25 or more years, we will not have an overworked IRS. Now, that said, I'm not defending the IRS. I'm just defending reality the way it is, and I'm making the argument that you can't whine that the IRS is overworked when you keep adding all of these extra non-tax related burdens to the agency. You got to get rid of the non-tax related burdens, let them focus on their core mission, which is to enforce the Internal Revenue Code and to help people comply with the Internal Revenue Code. That's what they're supposed to be doing, and we need to focus on that. Now we get the size of the IRS under control, the functions of the IRS under control, and at the same time, we can work on abolishing the Internal Revenue Code and going to something that's far more simple, fair, and efficient.
Right, right. Because at this point, I mean, the only way to get the mission drift under control and get the vastness of the agency under control is to simplify the code in its entirety. And we've talked about that. We've talked about that at ad nauseum on this, and we can certainly go down that rabbit hole again. But for now, tax.
I'll say this too. As long as Congress keeps adding these welfare programs into the federal law that are administered by the Internal Revenue Service, the Affordable Care Act is another example of that, right? Government-sponsored health insurance administered by the Internal Revenue Service. The IRS enforces the Affordable Care Act, right? That's what they do. Tremendous burden on the agency that was created in 2012, 2014, right in that area when this thing first started. That exacerbated the problem, and it's a pretty good example. As long as you keep loading these things onto the Internal Revenue, they're never going to have enough employees. You could hire 150,000, you could hire 200,000 of these people, and it won't be enough as long as the federal government continues to impose additional duties on the agency that they were never designed or intended to carry out.
Well, tax day itself is actually coming now, so what can people do if they can't file their taxes on time?
Well, if you can't file your tax return on time, you need to be aware of the filing extension. IRS Form 4868 is an automatic extension of time to file your tax return. You file that return on or before April 15th, the due date of the tax return. I think it's the 15th. April 15th is typically the filing deadline. If you file that Form 4868, on or before the filing deadline, automatically get a 6-month extension of time. File your return. No questions asked, no explanation needed, no fine associated with it. You're not charged with late filing the tax return. As long as you file that return by the extended due date, which is then October 15th, you're good to go. You got no problem preparing the tax return based on that extension.
And that's particularly good for people who might have a lot of expenses throughout the year and definitely don't have, much income coming in for their business or whatever. But if someone has a lot of tax that they have to pay, does that filing extension automatically get them extra time to pay that tax too?
No, it doesn't. That's a good question, and it's a misconception. It's very, very common. People make the mistake of believing that if they don't have the money to pay the tax by the April deadline, all they got to do is submit that filing extension, the 4868. That gets them till October 15th, and they think that gives them a payment extension. It does not. Filing extension is not an extension of time to pay. The tax still has to be paid by April 15th. The problem is, of course, most people don't realize what their tax is until the return is prepared. So you got to make estimated tax payments based on the prior year's tax liability in order to avoid the underpayment penalty. But if you need time to pay the tax, we're talking about your 2024 taxes, and you're not going to be able to make that payment by April 15th by the due date, there's a different form that's available. This form is one of the best kept secrets that the IRS has from the American people, and they don't ever talk about this form. It's Form 1127. Form 1127 is called an application for extension of time to pay the taxes. And if you submit that form on or before April 15th, you can get up to 6 additional months to pay the taxes without penalties. Now, the interest still applies, penalty does not.
There's 2 different forms, one for the extension of time to file, which is great for someone who isn't making a whole lot of money. Then there's the extension of time to pay the tax, which is better for someone who makes a ton of money and just doesn't want to file their tax.
It's not a matter of just not wanting to pay. We're talking about people who don't have the ability to pay, and we're not necessarily talking about people that make a ton of money. That's not at all what the issue is. The issue is due to circumstances beyond your control, unforeseen circumstances that put you into a position where you had to make a choice between paying your taxes and feeding your family. Now you don't have the money to pay the taxes. because you opted to feed the family. What are your options? The option is to use that Form 1127. Now, there's an important distinction between these two forms that we need to point out. Filing extension, Form 4868, is automatic. You don't need a reason, no questions asked. The extension is automatic. Payment extension is not automatic. You do need a reason. You have to explain in the Form 1127 that you exercised reasonable business care and prudence in providing for your tax. You did the things a reasonable person would do, knowing that you had this tax obligation coming up, but due to circumstances beyond your control, you can't pay on time. All right. So there has to be some good faith explanation as to why you can't pay. You can't just say, well, IRS, we bought our tickets for the family cruise last week and now we're out of money. So, can I get a payment? You're going to face penalties and interest in that situation. The important factor that comes into play here, and that is hardship. All right. The term hardship, as used by the IRS, means inability to pay necessary living expenses. So if you were faced with a situation over the course of the last year that put you into a position, as I said, you simply could not pay necessary living expenses, or more accurately, if you paid the tax, you would be in a position where you couldn't pay necessary living expenses. That by definition is hardship. All right. So if you're facing a layoff, or if you're facing a downturn in your income for whatever reason, as a self-employed person, if you had some fire, flood, hurricane, some medical disaster of some kind, illness, injury, catastrophic injury, that sort of thing that put these financial demands on you that you could not foresee, then that's the kind of thing that causes hardship that will get you that extension.
So what you're saying is there's really no application for a rich person to just delay paying their taxes because they don't want.
No, there's not. Funny you bring that up, because this is one of the things that I'm seeing in the news now. Downturn in IRS employment is going to cause a downturn in enforcement, and that's going to create a circumstance where all the rich people take unfair advantage of the tax code of the situation, and they're just going to go into hiding and not pay their taxes. That has never been the case. Fact of the matter is, high income people pay all of the taxes. They pay the lion's share of the taxes, and they do that because they got legal talent and accounting talent that's online with them, either on retainer or on staff in some cases, to help make sure that these people stay in compliance. High income people are high income people because they're smart and they don't do stupid things with their money. And one of the most stupid things you can do is tempt fate when it comes to the IRS by deliberately disregarding financial release, by deliberately disregarding tax laws and regulations. High income people don't do that. They have a legal talent, they have accounting talent that they put into practice to keep them out of trouble. It's the low income people that don't have, or the medium income people that don't have the accounting talent, the legal talent to help them through their problems. They're the ones that get into trouble with the IRS.
So what about the people who owe so much money that they have a simple extension that just won't help?
Yeah, and that's not uncommon. Remember, the payment extension is only 6 months maximum, and so if you owe $2,000 or $3,000 to the IRS, well, maybe 6 months is going to be plenty of time. But if you owe $20,000 or $30,000 to the IRS, 6 months might not help you. In that situation, you need to be aware of another form. It's IRS Form 9465-9460. It's called an installment agreement request. You can submit that form online separately from your return, or you can file the form directly with your tax return, and that will start the wheels in motion to get you set up on an installment agreement with the IRS. If you owe less than $50,000 to the IRS, you can pay within 72 months. The process of setting up what the IRS calls a streamlined installment agreement is relatively simple. My book, How to Get Tax Amnesty, walks you right through the process to show you how to do it, and that will get you set up on an installment agreement where you pay the taxes over time, keep the IRS off your back and out of your face.
So they got options for installment agreements, and they got options for... What other options do they have for people who are in debt with the IRS and they can't afford to pay?
All right, if you've got a situation where you're not going to be able to pay back the IRS, where your income and assets are such that there's no way you can pay, and you've got a liability that's substantial, it may be 40 grand, it may be 400 grand, but you've got this significant liability that's going to follow you around, and an installment agreement is not going to be the problem. You need to consider an offer in compromise. An offer in compromise is the IRS's flagship settlement program. This is the program that allows you to go in there and negotiate a settlement for less than what is owed. So for example, let's say you owe the IRS $100,000 and there's no possible way you can pay that. You go into an offer in compromise scenario and you say, look, IRS, I owe you 100 grand. There's no way we can pay 100 grand, but we can pay 3,000, 5,000, 10,000, whatever the number may be. Based on that negotiated settlement, which is grounded on your income and your expenses and your assets and liabilities, the IRS has the authority to settle for less than what you owe. And we do these offers all the time. My book, How to Get Tax Amnesty, is on the cutting edge of this offer and compromise program and lays it out for you. This is something that we do for clients on a regular basis, and we are very, very good at negotiating these offers and compromise and getting reasonable settlements for people who just can't pay.
Well, that seems like a good place place to call it for the week. Thank you for watching, taxpayers, and remember that there is no such thing as a hopeless tax case, and if you think yours is the exception, then call the office or visit our website and to get a hold of Dan here, and he can help you see the daylight. Dan, tell them where else they can follow along with your taxpayers' rights crusade.
Follow me at Pillow Talks Taxes. I'm primarily on TikTok, Truth Social, and Facebook. Like and share the videos, and especially share them with your local government officials so we can work to get rid of the IRS.